most anti-disco demolition in the world tonight.
Disco sucks. Disco sucks. Disco sucks. And we're never going to let them forget it. 1, 2, 3, boom! Here they go.
Hello and welcome to the darkened room of music conversation.
I'm Darren.
And I'm Chris, and welcome to part 2 of our look into disco, its influence, and on this episode, its evolution.
Yeah.
Yeah, so at the beginning of the video, of course, you saw what happened at the ballpark on that fateful night in 1979.
Yeah.
And a lot of people think that the light switch just went off on disco, but that's not necessarily the case.
No.
And that's kind of what we're going to point on in this video here.
Cool.
All right, so before we look forward from that event, let's take a look at what got us there.
Okay.
The very beginnings of disco, and really disco kind of came from the underground dance world, the dance clubs, the discotheque. Well, where did those come from? You can actually go all the way back to 1947.
No way.
In Paris. Yeah, leave it to Paris to come up with something innovative like this. There was a nightclub there called the Whiskey A Go-Go. Le Whiskey A Go-Go, if you want to say that. So in 1953, the Whiskey A Go-Go decided to retool the club a little bit. They laid down a dance floor, they put up colored lights, and they installed 2 turntables and took out the jukebox.
2 turntables and a microphone.
That's right, Mr. Beck. So they did that so there could be no breaks in between the songs.
Yeah, continuous music.
Exactly, and continuous dancing. That was the point.
Right.
Yeah, it was considered the world's first discotheque.
Now, imagine how long ago that was. That's pretty crazy. I would have never guessed that it happened that early on.
Right, but this is in Paris, Paris ahead of the curve.
Inventive, yeah.
Yeah. Now, it was called a discotheque, but it wasn't necessarily disco music because it wasn't around yet. Oh. So disco gets its name from the dance clubs where it's played, discotheque.
Makes sense to me.
There you go. Yeah, so the Whiskey A Go-Go set into place like the standard elements of the modern post-World War II discotheque style nightclub.
Gotcha.
So here in the States, we're usually a little behind Europe, especially in the mid-20th century.
Yeah.
We tend to follow the trends from over there. It comes over to New York City, and about 1964 is when you see discotheques opening up in the city there. And places like the Village Vanguard, who had jazz, they would actually play the dance music in between jazz sets.
And you got to remember at this point in the United States, New York was a very innovative market.
It was.
Probably top 2 at that point. Los Angeles, New York.
There you go. Now, disco, the genre, the music itself, really has its roots in the New York underground club scene. That's where you would have like oppressed or marginalized groups who could come together, all from different backgrounds. They were safe havens.
Yeah.
For like homosexual partygoers to dance in peace and away from public scrutiny.
African Americans.
Yeah, Latinos.
Italians, Jewish folks.
Yeah. Think of a marginalized group back in the 70s, and this is their safe space.
Yeah, it was like a utopia space with music playing.
Yeah,
and that was their soundtrack for that.
That's right. So the underground club scene in New York started to grow and expand, and people started to pay attention. What is this disco stuff? What is this music? And record labels were paying attention, and eventually radio stations were paying attention.
They were looking for new trends.
Exactly right. Yeah. And so they picked up on disco. Yeah. And the very first #1 disco song, officially, according to the Billboard Bible, was Rock the Boat by the Hughes Corporation.
Love the song.
That's That's right.
Fantastic. And we're talking what year? Like 1974?
1974. It hit in July of that year for 1 week.
1 week.
And what dethroned it but yet another disco song, which Darren has an original copy of the 45 right here, Rock Your Baby by George McCrae.
George McCrae. And believe it or not, Bob Kulick, who guest starred on many, actually he was a ghost player on a lot of Kiss albums, and his brother Bruce ended up being in Kiss, actually toured with George McCrae back then.
Yeah, I have heard that.
Yeah,
that's
very
interesting.
Cool. Yeah.
George one-upped Hughes Corporation by staying in the #1 spot for 2 weeks.
Yes, sir.
There you go.
Yeah.
So,
and I love both of those songs.
Yeah, I do too.
I really do.
They're really fun childhood memories for me.
Yeah.
So from that point on, we kind of know what happened with disco. You know, throughout the rest of the decade, its popularity, how it influenced rock music, like we brought up in the last episode.
Everybody and their brother was doing a disco song.
That's right, which means it started to get oversaturated. And, you know, there were actually haters of disco. You know, a lot of people who loved rock and roll, you know, to their core, just thought it was awful.
It was the worst form of music ever. Yeah.
And in some ways, they had an argument because there was some garbage out at the time. You know, it's, like you mentioned in the last episode, some of that stuff, when you sing about just boogie, oogie, oogieing, you know, that gets old.
Yeah, yeah. It's very shallow subject matter. And I think one of the things that happened, especially in retrospect when you look at this, a lot of the people that were into the disco, and we have already discussed that, was like marginalized groups, you know, like the gays and black folks and Jewish folks and all that. They got really offended by the backlash. They took it personally.
Yes.
They really did. They thought it was an attack on them personally, and I really don't think so. I think it was more an attack on the genre itself.
I think you're right. So the hatred of disco was building and building, and it reached its peak and its blowing point on that night on July 12th, 1979.
That's right. It was a baseball game between the Chicago White Sox at Comiskey Park playing the Detroit Tigers. It was a doubleheader, which means 2 games for the price of 1 if you're keeping score at home. And in the intermission is when they were going to do this event.
If you brought a disco record to this event, you could actually get in for under $1.
$1 for 2 baseball games.
Less than $1, yeah. The idea behind this actually came from the radio station reps and the Chicago White Sox promoters.
And see, I never knew that.
Yeah.
I never knew how that came to be. So
it was actually not the idea of the DJ Steve Dahl, who was the ringleader of this. He's in the video. You see him with the military helmet on the microphone.
Declaring war.
Agging on the crowd. Yeah. He was a 24-year-old disc jockey. He was angry.
Yeah.
He was out for revenge because he got fired from a Chicago radio station when it too went all disco. So in his new job at a rival rock station, he took out his frustration by destroying disco records on the air. And what he would do is, you know, he'd play a little bit of it, scratch the needle across, and play an explosion. So that's kind of how the ideas both came together. You know, his on-air act. And the Chicago White Sox were looking to increase their attendance at the park because it was kind of waning there for
the visibility and everything. They thought it would be a good event to draw people in, and it did, but probably not quite in the way that they had hoped.
Yeah. And it coined the phrase "disco sucks." You heard at the beginning there, the people chanting, and you would think that, according to music historians, that disco just went away completely. That's not necessarily the case.
It wasn't like it just flipped a switch. Now, disco at that point, to your point, very looked down on as a genre of music by a large group of people at this point. They're thinking disco's not very cool.
People that did like disco, you know, for crying out loud, they're not going to all of a sudden see this event like, well, all these people think it sucks, so I guess I should stop listening to it.
And have you seen the people that were, how they were acting at this event?
Yeah.
Hardly trendsetters, I would say.
Right.
Yeah.
So, we're going to get into the path of the evolution and the influence down several different paths, in fact.
Yeah, it had to kind of reinvent itself.
That's right. Leading into the 80s all the way up to today.
Yes.
So why don't we make our first stop in the R&B world?
Let's get it. So you got to remember 1979 into 1980, there was a lot of music that was already recorded that had the disco flavor. And what do you think the record labels are going to do? They're going to be like, oh, okay, disco sucks, so we can't release this stuff.
Yeah.
They're already in the can. They were good songs, so they got released. And guess what? They still hit. Yep. We're talking about songs like Funky Town by Lip Sync.
I want to take me to Funky Town.
We're talking about Celebration by Kool and the Gang.
It's up to you. What's your pleasure?
These were humongous hits. The SOS Band, Take Your Time.
Take your time.
These are songs that would have been classified disco songs, but they went ahead and classified them as R&B/dance music.
Yeah.
Because it wasn't cool to say that you were disco. Michael Jackson, his early songs Off the Wall, Don't Stop Till You Get Enough. Once again, totally a disco song, but...
Yeah, but you can kind of hear a difference in style and quality of that. The Quincy Jones, of course, producing the Michael Jackson stuff. You can tell a slight difference. There's a different level there between disco and the Michael Jackson R&B.
Yeah, and we're going to hit on that in just a second. But there were definitely songs that were straight up, had the sound, had the style. I think the best example of this after that event in 1979 is Diana Ross, I'm Coming Out.
Yes, there you go.
A song written by Nile Rodgers, produced by the Chic Guys, has very much that disco quality, the sound, everything is completely disco. The Whispers, they had a song too, and the beat goes on. Straight up disco with strings and all that stuff. So we're talking, this is 1980. This is still happening.
Right.
All right, so there were three things that happened in the evolution of disco. One of the things, and this is not one of the three, but they didn't want to call it disco anymore because it wasn't cool.
Right.
But three things that happened as far as going forward and progressing is that the music itself progressed. Disco music was primarily really simple bass lines, really simple productions, very obvious what was happening.
Yeah.
The production quality went way up, in my opinion, with guys like you mentioned, Quincy Jones.
Yeah.
He took a more sophisticated approach to these songs that would have been considered disco. You take a song like Don't Stop Till You Get Enough, and he made it a little bit more complex, more like some jazz-oriented R&B type things in there, which was cool. And I think the subject matter itself progressed too. Disco songs, like we talked about, were pretty lame subject matter. There was a lot more depth in the lyrical content of songs.
Yes.
Now, they called this post-disco, and me and you had a friendly argument a few weeks ago when we were coming up with this episode regarding the song Earth by Earth, Wind, and Fire, Let's Groove.
Yeah.
Now, that song, I completely agree, subject matter-wise, is probably more on the disco side.
Yeah, that was kind of at the tail end of the disco. Yeah.
It's got horns in it. It's got string parts. But there's a lot of synthesizer, and I think that was one of the key differences, too.
Yeah.
It's produced a lot more complex than your typical disco record.
Yeah.
The sounds are a lot more modern. And that was something that continued out of the traditional disco songs into what was going on.
Yeah.
Rick James, Give It To Me, Baby. That's more of like a funk song.
Yeah.
But definitely you hear some growth there. All the Prince stuff, which we'll get into more about him later.
Yeah.
Yarbrough and Peoples, Don't Stop the Music. That's a tremendous song.
Yeah.
Definitely out of the ashes of disco, but something different going on there.
Yeah, yeah.
It's got a whole different, more sophisticated vibe to it.
Yeah, right around this time, you started to hear more electronic and keyboard type stuff being incorporated into music in the pop world in general.
Exactly.
So that's kind of how it began to morph into that direction from disco.
I agree.
But I think it would not have gone down that path if it weren't for disco to begin with.
Correct. Bands like the Daz Band, Let It Whip. Once again, a silly song.
Yeah.
Kind of goofy subject matter. The production is just outstanding.
It is, yeah.
Think about a song like Sexual Healing by Marvin Gaye. Think about the style that Marvin Gaye played up to that point.
Yeah, yeah.
And then you hear a song like that. The production is way more sophisticated. Definitely aimed at a urban dance-oriented market.
Absolutely.
And, you know, it's probably, in my opinion, I would say it is a continuation of disco.
Yeah.
In a sense.
Yeah.
Shannon, Let the Music Play, lots of...
Oh, I love that song.
We started dancing and love put us in.
Wonderful synthesizer in that song. Donna Summer, she works hard for the money.
Yeah.
And Cameo, I mean, you had the early R&B vibing stuff like Alligator Woman all the way into the 80s with, you know, like Word Up and Candy. And She's Strange and all these songs that were definitely born out of the ashes of disco, but once again, produced differently.
Totally, yeah. You can, if you line these songs up in a timeline from, you know, 79, Michael Jackson all the way through the mid-'80s, you can actually see a gradual progression.
Yeah.
From Michael Jackson to, say, you know, Shannon and a Cameo.
Agreed.
You can see the curve. It's there.
And it didn't stop with just R&B and urban music.
No, that's right. It went right into the rock and roll world, and that kind of started when that little network again, MTV, hits the airwaves.
Yes, sir.
So, disco having come from the underground, once this event happened in the ballpark and it lost favor with the general public, it kind of went back to the underground again. You know, a lot of the discotheques, you know, were still in operation. Many of them closed, but many stayed open. And they were having to find music to play for people to dance to. And it was coming from a different place now.
Yeah.
You know, a lot of bands were starting to use the electronic instruments. They were influenced by bands like Kraftwerk. Some of it was coming from overseas. We're thinking of like Depeche Mode and Joy Division. Yeah, that was getting played like crazy in the dance clubs. They weren't calling them discos anymore.
Right.
Leading up to that, this little network called MTV hits the airwaves. Once again, we have to bring that up.
Yeah.
And they began playing a lot of what's called the second British wave.
Yes.
They had to fill the gaps in their programming because so many bands here in America didn't make music videos, but a lot of them in Europe did. So they were playing a lot of that, and that was introducing the United States to a lot of British bands for the first time.
Right.
And that eventually led to 1982, really the first British second wave band to make the Billboard chart was the Human League and Don't You Want Me.
And that song went #1, by the way. So it wasn't just hit the charts. It was a massive blockbuster hit.
It blew out the top of it.
It sure did. And I loved the song. And still do to this day. I think it's great. I think it sounds great. But to your point is very well taken. It was dance music. When you get right down to it, at the end of the day, it's an energetic dance record.
Yeah, and the Human League, you know, began to really influence the sound in the rock and roll world and the new rave world. And it brought along bands like Naked Eyes with Always Something There to Remind Me.
How can I forget you?
You think of bands like Talk Talk and Kaja Goo Goo.
It's my life to shine, shine, hush, hush.
ABC even. I mean,
Shut that voice and run through my whole.
you know, these are fantastic bands. They took the basics from disco and they applied it to a new style of music with electronic keyboards, and they made, I think, a better product.
Yeah.
Not to disparage disco, of course.
No,
There's
it was
a lot of good disco.
It was an evolution.
Evolution is the best way to put it. Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah, and if it weren't for disco, you know, we wouldn't have this stuff. We wouldn't have Duran Duran.
My name is Rio and she.
As you get more into the 80s, it starts to really influence some of the rock and rollers once again. Think of David Bowie and Let's Dance.
Yeah.
Under moonlight, this
Yeah, and we talked about Queen in the previous episode.
That's
which
right.
You can watch right up over here.
Yep.
But yeah, I totally agree. There was definitely an obvious disco vibe with that. And in some ways, it may have broadened its appeal because, you know, the urban crowd were still listening to the R&B stuff,
Yep.
which still existed. We already talked about that evolution. And then now all of a sudden you have, you know, people from other countries white folks, white kids, they're digging this stuff out of England.
Yeah.
So in a way, it broadened its appeal.
It really did, yeah. And disco may not have been around as an official genre anymore, but its influence was definitely reaching out far and beyond from where it came from.
And once again, another great point by you. MTV's playing this stuff.
That's right, yeah. And in fact, I just learned this recently. Prince probably would not have been the megastar he was in the 80s if it weren't for Funky Town by Lip Sync.
This is a cool story.
Yeah, absolutely. Someone close to him actually said that Prince was angry that a band from Minneapolis with the stupid song had gotten so popular.
Yeah.
And he made it a career to one-up them.
Right. And also, not lost in all this was that it was a nerdy white guy.
Right. Yeah. If you see, I'll show you a picture of the guy who actually wrote the song.
Yeah, that looks like a rock star, right?
Right, yeah. So, Prince was like, no, I'm going to put Minneapolis on the map.
Yeah.
And boy, did he.
No, I like Funky Town.
I do too, yeah.
I do.
Absolutely, yeah. It's one of those songs you can't get out of your head.
No.
For sure.
And speaking of not being able to get out of your head, another good example would be Kylie Minogue, Can't Get It Out of My Head. That's a perfect example of where disco evolved to.
That's right. Eventually in the mid-'80s on, it influenced house music, electronic music. That Kylie Minogue, definitely a great example.
Yeah, and then a lot of bands would just kind of pay an homage to it.
Yeah.
A good example is, check a little segment out of this, a little sample here, No Doubt, and You Can Do It. This is off the Tragic Kingdom Blockbuster album.
Yeah.
You can clearly hear the disco influence right here.
Yeah, absolutely. So even in the 90s, it was kind of poking its head out a little bit.
Yes, and then disco had a resurgence in the 90s as far as like clubs would have disco nights.
Yeah.
Dance clubs that ordinarily played the top 40 music of the day, they would have certain nights designated to just play disco songs.
Which is actually happening now.
It's
once
happening
again.
now. Yes.
Yeah. So we can probably credit like artists like Doja Cat with Say So.
Why don't you say so?
Lady Gaga put one out with Ariana Grande. I heard that and was like, that's straight up disco.
And I love it. I think it's cool.
Yeah. And most recently, of course, Dua Lipa. These are definite disco sounds.
And that's another lesson too. Any kind of genre of music that's ever big, especially a genre like disco, it never goes away totally. It either evolves or at some point someone just does a piss take, novelty version of it.
Yeah.
And that's just the way it is. You think of like Harry Connick in the early 90s. He was emulating the big band Frank Sinatra, vocalist type stuff. And
and that led to a trend in itself. You had Michael Bublé and others come along after that.
Chris Isaac, who kind of emulated like the Roy Orbison kind of stylings and stuff. So, this happens throughout history.
It does, yeah. A genre never truly goes away. It still pokes its head up every now and then. Even with the hair metal. Yeah. When grunge came along, there were still people hanging on to hair metal.
Yeah.
Early 2000s, you had the darkness.
Which was straight up a throwback to, the hair metal stuff.
Yeah.
No doubt about it. So, that's a good point. People didn't just all of a sudden, when everybody tells you something's, hey, this isn't cool anymore.
Yeah.
People that's into that genre, they're not just going to desert it.
Right.
There's going to be some Klingons anyway.
Klingons. One of the points I wanted to make with this video was that disco deserves more credit. It had far more influence than people realize or even maybe give it credit for.
Yeah, and also the post-disco movement and where it evolved to afterwards, I think was better than the original version.
Yeah, absolutely. I would agree with that. So what do you think? Drop it down in the comments. Click like on the video if you liked what we said. And let's play some trivia. What do you say?
Let's get it.
All right. Ready to put your thinking cap on?
Yeah, last time we got a post-disco draw.
We did. Yeah.
Yeah, this is never planned, by the way. We never know what we're going to get.
Right. I'm drawing randomly from the front here, putting it to the back when we're done. The category this time is mosh pit.
Okay, the opposite of disco.
Yeah. Well, this is going to be about live music. So, it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be a metal question. Right. It could be anything live.
True.
So the question is, who had a 1989 live album called A Show of Hands?
Duh. That would be Rush.
The choices are Boz Scaggs,
Nope.
Queen,
Nope.
George Michael.
No, Rush.
Yeah, Rush is the last one.
like I'm gonna miss that question. Yeah, Show of Hands was pretty cool. I was very excited at the time
I'm
when
showing
it came
my
out.
hands. So
Yeah. I was very excited at the time because that I had really gotten into Rush during the whole Hold Your Fire period.
Yeah.
You know, I was a teenager and I'd kind of taken a journey where I'd gotten into them, went back in reverse order and got a lot of the earlier stuff. Of course, I'd already heard, moving pictures and stuff like that, but
Yeah.
went back and got the early stuff like the self-titled and Fly By Night and Cross Steel. So when that came out, I couldn't wait because I'm like, ooh, it's finally a brand new Rush thing,
Yeah.
Granted, it was a live album, and I'm not crazy about live albums, but I'm crazy about that live album. It's very, very good.
I was the same way when Delicate Sound of Thunder by Pink Floyd came out. I was just newly into them, and it's like, cool, a live album coming out from something that I'm really into.
Yeah.
And again, it's good live album, but, I'm not as like you are in the live albums.
And then fortunately with Rush, they worked a little bit harder, let's face it, than Pink Floyd. They, later that year, by the fall of '89, they released Presto. So I actually had a new studio album.
That is correct. Yeah. Well, when creative genius usually takes a little longer, so that's why they space out.
Yeah, maybe we could go head to head, Rush versus Pink Floyd, one of these days. Who knows?
Maybe that could be a good idea for an episode.
Yeah, it could be further down the road.
All right. Well, thanks for joining us, guys.
This was fun. I learned a lot about disco.
Yeah, I did too. Yeah, there's a lot of stuff in our research, and I'm like, wow, I did not know that. Especially the thing about Prince. That was really cool.
I hope you guys learned something too.
Absolutely. And come back again. We'll have another video soon, and maybe you'll learn something new then as well.
Cool.
Take care, guys.
See ya.